In this presentation, we're going to look at those moral systems that have been popular mainly in the West over about the last half millennia, the last 500 years. We're going to refer to those as modern ethical systems, largely because that same period of time, the last 500 years, has been what is known in philosophy and so on as the modern era. And so we're going to be looking at how morals have changed over that time. And we'll also compare it to probably the only real competitor to Western morality, which we find with other cultures, particularly with indigenous cultures. We'll just do that briefly at the end. And that will pretty much complete our survey of the different moral systems that exist. Modernity began around the year 1500, and the chap who is billed as the father of modern philosophy is Niccolao Machiavelli, an Italian diplomat. Machiavelli was influenced by the thought of John Wycliffe, who came a bit more than a century before him, and had presented the ideas that rather than looking for understanding as a form of conforming one's thinking to the external reality, really one's own thinking can be the whole reference for one's worldview, if you like. Wycliffe affected really the thinking in a number of different areas of culture. That will be another topic. Machiavelli himself was a diplomat. He was a public servant, if you like, in a turbulent and troubled time in Italy, particularly in Florence. And as Florence went through this turbulent political period where the government was changed from a republic to a monarchy, Machiavelli was faced with a rather unpleasant prospect, and that was of losing his job and his status in the community, because his republic had fallen, was replaced by a monarch. And so Machiavelli thought the most appropriate way to gain favour with the new monarch was to prove to him that he wasn't that concerned about the republican form of government. He was more interested in simply doing a good job as a diplomat, as a public servant. And so he wrote a book for the new monarch titled The Prince, and it was really a manual for how to be an effective political leader, particularly a effective autocratic political leader. I'm going to ask you to read a couple of chapters of The Prince to get a bit of a flavour for it. You can read the whole book if you like. It's not very long, and it is easy to read. The first time I read it, I actually thought it was a satire. I didn't think it was serious, but I'll leave that for you to discover. Machiavelli's method was to use history rather than logical deduction to make decisions and conclusions about how a prince, how a monarch should behave, with the object of achieving political stability. After all, for a public servant, you don't really care who the government is as long as you've got a nice job and a solid political, social sort of standing. And the real contribution that came out of Machiavelli's observations of history was that moral decisions, especially for political leaders or any other kind of leader, should be based ultimately on being able to juggle the management of appearance over the reality of a situation. I guess today we would call it public relations. If we look at Machiavelli's conclusions, we can find that in chapter 15 of The Prince, where he writes, amongst other things, "It is necessary for a prince wishing to hold his own to know how to do wrong and to make use of it, or not, according to necessity." This is a very powerful statement. What Machiavelli is saying here is that even though we know what right and wrong is, in particular cases, it is better, more effective, it achieves your ethical objectives to practice wrong, evil if you like, even though you know that it's evil, because it will obtain the objectives that you want, the higher good, the summum bonum. And for Machiavelli, the summum bonum, the greatest good, was political stability. I guess for the prince as well. His summum bonum, assuming that he's a political creature, is to maintain his power. And so for Machiavelli, he said the best way to maintain your power is to know how to do wrong when it's necessary, when it's appropriate. It really implies an awareness of objective morals, the sort of things that we've been looking at previously. It's one thing to know what is right and wrong. What Machiavelli is recommending is that you don't necessarily do it. It is necessarily a short-term perspective. If we look back through history, we see a number of outstanding leaders. Suleiman comes to mind as somebody who had short-term objectives and basically assassinated his way to the top. But in the long term, he was only strong enough through his own lifetime until he grew older, and then following him were other leaders who attempted to do the same thing. And so you end up with a political system led by people who only support themselves by their own personal strength. And strength there is not good strength, it is simply the power to get what you want. It's a little bit creepy. When you read through The Prince, and as I say, I'd like you to read at least a couple of chapters, chapters 15 and 16 would be a good start, get an idea of how Machiavelli is winding this recommendation, this ethic, this set of appropriate principles for princes to behave, into a system of action, and how it definitely puts aside normal idea of virtue, and certainly the idea of respecting one's political leaders. Overall, Machiavelli's ethic, the public side of it, what the rest of the world sees, is entirely empty of effective content. Because after all, if your prince, your political leader, whether it's a prime minister or a president today, is somebody who goes out of his way to appear to be honest while strategically employing dishonesty, once that becomes apparent, and it just about always does, people further on down the line, the social order, will consider it fair game to apply the same rules. And you end up with a rather chaotic culture as a result. The question of pragmatism comes up when we deal with Machiavelli. Pragmatism is the principle that you do what works. And so you have an objective and you simply do whatever works to achieve it. So a spot of murder or embezzlement will achieve perhaps the downthrow of some evil empire, and under Machiavelli, so long as most people believe you're an honest person, you can get away with illegality or bribery. If they believe that you are a kind and caring person, you will probably be more likely to be able to get away with a spot of assassination, and so on. The end justifies the mean. The second aspect of Machiavellian ethics is that it's ultimately subjectivist. It means that you don't really care about what is objectively right or wrong. In Machiavelli, you explicitly know what is right and wrong. But you choose your principles for action, your moral principles, and therefore your ethic, simply from what works for you. Fairly obviously, in a Machiavellian world, there is not likely to be a great deal of trust. And we can certainly see this in certain parts of the European community, certainly the elites in Europe around this time, that there were complex and arcane goings-on of people betraying and exploiting each other and so on. It wasn't very pretty, even though it purported to be very right and proper. Machiavelli basically plugged into this and did pretty much what the sophists had done roughly 2,000 years before, and they could see what the community wanted, and the sophists gave them a set of principles that would enable them to do it with impunity without getting a guilty conscience. Machiavelli is basically doing the same thing. He could see what the prince really wanted. The prince wanted to be a tyrant, and so Machiavelli is giving him all the reasons why being a tyrant is a good thing. It's been said that many modern politicians probably go to bed each night with a copy of The Prince under their pillow. But I'll leave that for you to make your decisions. You would probably apply it to whatever political party you do not vote for. Let's look a little bit further at modernity. Modernity is fundamentally a philosophical system. It is a reaction, a rebellion to the dominant philosophy that went before it. And modernity is based philosophically on the idea that the only things that you can know come through your experience, come through your senses. 5 senses, 5 ways of knowing, and that's as far as it goes. It means, therefore, that you're interested primarily in what appears to you, what you can see and touch and feel, not necessarily the backstories. And as we go into modernity from a philosophical point of view, we can see that this means that things like metaphysics and other more subtle aspects of philosophy are simply ignored, because the only things that are real are things that you can get to with your senses. The difficulty with modernity conceptually is that there are many things that are important that you cannot sense directly. You can't even see someone reading a book, really. You can see them looking at the pages. They might even be reciting words, but you don't know if they're actually reading it or not, because all you see is a person holding a book. They might say they're reading it, but you really don't know. And so modernity prevents us from being able to draw these more abstract conclusions. And there are other aspects, things like the ideas of justice, fairness, integrity, and so on, that we've been talking about. In fact, we've been dealing with in all of our discussions. You can't see it. What you can see, though, is simply behaviours. And it gives a kind of superficiality to your appreciation of what is around you. And you might say, well, that's a bit ridiculous, and perhaps you're right. And I don't know whether it's absolutely possible for people to live totally this way, but it becomes one of the curiosities of the way that modern philosophers and those who use modern philosophy kind of approach their world. When we look at the kind of society that modernity produces, we can think in terms of the relationships, if you like, the social integration, if you like, of a Machiavellian prince with those around him, especially those who are at least a little bit savvy as to how the prince is operating and perhaps have decided to do the same themselves for their own benefits. It is a radically individualist society, because really you can't trust the other in any relationship, because if they're playing Machiavellian games with you, how will you know whether you can trust them or not? The only reason that you might have a relationship with them is because you consider that you're going to in some way be better off as a result of that association. And so modernity, following on from Machiavelli, sees society as an association, a universal association, or at least a club, if you like. And a bit the same way that you might have a club devoted to, say, a sport or something, where the members will join the club, support the club, and so on the basis of what the club will do to them, for them. And if the club does not perform, if it turns out you lose too many rugby matches, if it's a rugby club, then you'll simply terminate your membership and go and join somewhere else. The rise of modernity roughly came through the 15th century, the 1400s, and it came into prominence in the 1500s, the 16th century, and so on. Can be seen in the economic record as associated with radical polarization of wealth. We can describe that as the impoverishment of the working people. In Australia, we can see the effects of that because the colonisation of Australia, we only had European people come to Australia as a result of Britain running out of space in its jails. And why did it run out of space in its jails? It was because so many people in Britain, which at the time was the economic giant of the world, didn't have enough space in its prisons. Why was that? It was because most ordinary people in Britain, working people we might call them, their earnings were so low that they were hardly able to support themselves, not able to support a family. And as a result, a large proportion of them were forced into some form of dishonesty in order to live, to survive. And so you had to steal fruit off a neighbour's tree or something in order to stop your family from starving to death. People were desperate. And so the first fleet in Australia came over full of people from the richest country in the world, where numerically most of the people in that country were starving poor. And that's very much a result of modernity. And you can see that very clearly coming out. But basically, modernity and that polarisation of wealth. People were thinking about it and starting to get it moving in the 1400s. It got really serious in the 1500s. For instance, around the year 1500 in England, the average working family, average working man, the wages, were sufficient to support 3.5 working families, which meant that you didn't have to work 52.5 weeks of the year, or you could support an extended family on the income of a single working man. That was around the year 1500. 100 years later, England saw fit to pass the first of its, what I might call its serious poor laws, its unemployment relief, because the average person in England now was not working, not earning 3.5 times the average cost of living. They were earning barely 1 time that, and therefore they weren't able to support a poor cousin or something like that, or an aged parent. They could hardly support themselves. And so standards of living were falling, unemployment became a huge problem that the community wasn't able to support, support unemployed people directly, and so they needed an external institution. And so the poor laws in England were actually an indictment, if you like, on the change of economic conditions of the average working person. Thorold Rogers was writing about this around the beginning of the 20th century, if you're interested in following it up. Also, the work of Julian Simon, the economist, is useful in this respect. We've spoken about capitalism. In the 19th century, those extremes, the impoverishment of the workers and so on, it gave rise to things like Charles Dickens and his works, Oliver Twist and the rest. Dickens was trying to get the minds of the middle class Englishmen to the plights of the of the ordinary working family, ordinary working man in England. And that's why he wrote Oliver Twist and the rest of them. Unfortunately, it also gave rise to the socialist movement, which became the political movement, which we usually know today as communism. So socialism and communism are pretty much products of this extreme impoverishment of working people, which gave them the enthusiasm to rebel politically, and so on. And communism and socialism have been a blight on our society ever since. The other indicator, the other result of the adversarial association model of society is largely the demise of family values, and it was partly stimulated by the impoverishment, the wealth polarization. If you have great poverty, you can't afford the luxury of a family. Today, people might spend 6 months' wages on their wedding and still be able to live through the honeymoon. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, people simply weren't able to do that. They weren't even able to, ride off after their wedding on a bicycle because they couldn't afford a bicycle. Family values went down. People couldn't afford to get married. They still had children and so on. And you ended up with prostitution and many unfortunate problems kind of coming from that. One of the less obvious results of modernity through this process, once you can't afford to have families, it means that your inclination towards what we'll call solidarity starts to fall away. If you don't know who your father is, you're psychologically, more disinclined, if you like, to trust larger communities and so on, and perhaps contribute to things that you don't understand in the way that maybe sort of children might do chores around the house because they understand that their parents are there and they trust their parents and so on. Once you lose trust, you have great difficulty psychologically orientating yourself to really will for the good of the community. And so whereas Alexander could raise an army quite easily, that ease has fallen away sometime over the years. And we can see that happening, say, through the 20th century, where at the beginning of the 20th century, it was relatively easy to give the call and lots of people would come very willing to sign up to fight for the country. We saw that in Australia for the First World War, the Anzac tradition and so on. Marvellous thing. But as we're getting closer to the end of the 20th century, trying to get soldiers to go to Vietnam, well, that certainly proved to be not very popular. And to a certain extent, similar things have been observed with respect to the more recent skirmishes that the Australian military has been involved with. There is far less inclination to stand up and fight for those values that we believe in, and that's something which is happening around the world. In the United States, it's especially evident. We're finding sane people to volunteer for military service is becoming a bit more challenging for the military. So a dilution of solidarity is important. The sociologist Carl Zimmerman predicted the early part of last century, roughly 80 or 100 years ago, that society would become atomized, that you would no longer have a single cohesive thing called a society. Say the evidence of that would be in something like patriotism. It would be more just a collection of individuals that would be very interested in getting their own needs met and so on. And that whole challenge, I'm not going to say that it's completely happened, but by comparison with, say, indigenous communities, the modern West is far less cohesive, far less inclined to act as a unit, as a group. And we find this. You can't really say that something has changed absolutely, but what you can say is that the tendency has been diluted, reduced, whatever. And this is something that is evident when you look at the cohesiveness of a society between, say, the year 11 or 1200 versus, say, the 20th century, certainly the latter part of the 20th century. You can see this atomization happening. And one way or another, there are a number of what we'd call contingent costs. By contingent costs, we're not talking about money costs necessarily, although in some cases that is true. The costs are in terms of lower levels of psychological sense of well-being. Certainly some economic indicators are not always positive. The curious thing about it is that human happiness, when people have attempted to measure it, and over the last 20 or 30 years or so, economists have taken interest in measuring happiness on occasions. They probably get bored with measuring money, and so they go off and try and look at who's happy and who's not. What they have found, and some of you may be familiar with these studies, is that in some cases, the happiest communities in the world are far from the wealthiest. They may not have running water, they may not have dental services, but they might be a lot happier than those people who do. And when we look around the world, we can see the likelihood of individuals being on antidepressants or some other therapeutic drug to overcome some psychological distress is far higher in the wealthy countries than the poorer ones. And it's not simply because they can't afford them. It has got something to do with wealth not necessarily leading to happiness. Now, these are controversial questions, and we won't go too far into them now, but it's worth being aware of. We've mentioned Machiavelli as the father of modernity. He gave an argument, if you like, and as you read through The Prince, most people who read it find the argumentation relatively quaint, shall we say, and more rhetoric than logic. And so it took a while for the principles that motivated modernity to be turned into more cohesive systems of thinking. That largely happened during a period which is remembered as the Enlightenment. It's as though in the 1700s a great light came into the West. Whether or not that is totally true or not, I'll let you decide. That's the name we call it. We use a similar rhetoric when we look at what we call the Renaissance, another period of apparently ideas happening in a good direction. And so we have the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century. We're going to be looking primarily at David Hume because David Hume is known as the father of British empiricism. And so in the English-speaking tradition, Hume stands out as probably one of the most outstanding figures. On the continent, there were others paralleling Hume, thinking more or less the same thoughts, with names like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, and so on. And there's quite a group of Enlightenment thinkers on the continent, mainly in France. David Hume and Adam Smith both had a certain amount to do with their French counterparts, to the extent that Rousseau came to visit Hume on one occasion, and they were, in a sense, good friends. Hume is both dubbed as the father of British empiricism. Empiricism is that branch of philosophy that has to do with the science of knowing, the investigation into what causes people to know stuff. He is also dubbed by his admirers, oddly enough, as the greatest philosophical terrorist of all time. Because Hume came as a relatively young man and wrote 2 books covering roughly the same content that pretty much turned philosophy on its head. Because Hume argued through his works that philosophy didn't need a metaphysics. In fact, he said something like, if you see metaphysics, you know that whoever you're talking to is definitely wrong. And so the whole importance of metaphysics was thrown out with Hume. Hume argued, as I mentioned earlier, that the only things you know are those things that you can see and touch, hear, smell, and so on, what you can sense. But he went a little bit further than that. He said, well, because you only are aware of your sensations, how do you know that your sensations are actually telling you what is out there? Our recent movie, The Matrix, if you haven't seen it, then definitely have a look at it so you can understand what I'm about to say, is all about a situation where you have an entire community of people who think they're living in one world, whereas in fact they're living in something quite different. They're actually locked up in little scientific pods, being drained of their energy or some weird thing, while simultaneously thinking that they're living in Western cities and doing Western things and having Western relationships and all that sort of stuff. But in fact, all of the people they touch and the work that they do and the happiness and sadness they experience is all just the result of a huge computer program. Hume was the first one to think up something like that. He had this idea that while he could see someone coming towards him, he didn't know whether it was just a mirage or not. And Hume went so far as to say that when he was doing philosophy, he was not sure whether his maid existed. However, he goes on, when she brings him in his tea, he finds it more convenient to do so. And what he's saying there is that as a philosopher, he cannot be sure of the existence of anything outside of himself. But as an ordinary man getting about the place, it's more convenient to make other conclusions. Some might say more common sense conclusions, and I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions about that. There's a fair bit of metaphysics or anti-metaphysics about Hume's thought. The forms cannot be known, so you really can't do any abstraction. Hume's ideas were considered to be radical and not necessarily popular in themselves. However, their conclusions, their implications were considered to be important. Hume earned his income from a book that he wrote titled The History of England. Curious thing about the history of England was that it's really fables about England as the English want to hear them. It didn't have to do very much with the facts. It was continuing a tradition that had arisen a couple of centuries earlier in England of writing histories as ways of, if you like, training the community to achieve your own political ends. I guess almost a Machiavellian objective. And so Hume's History of England, in a sense, was almost an application of his thinking. It was good at communicating ideas, but not necessarily those conformed in reality. However, selling his History of England did pay his bills, so it was an important part of Hume's overall character. English history, by the way, has been a bit of a battleground from about the 1500s right up until the 20th century. There was a bit of a controversy in the 19th century, in other words, about 100 years after Hume, over English history. There was a 10-volume set of history written by an Englishman by the name of John Lingard. And the English historical establishment wasn't very fond of Lingard's history because it was so radically different to Hume's. However, the most frustrating thing about Lingard's history was that the British historical set weren't able to condemn it because Lingard used a very curious methodology. His approach to history was to write it by, first of all, looking at original documents and original facts that were apparent in front of him, things like government statements, commercial records, and so on. And the contrast between Lingard's history and Hume's is really quite extraordinary. Lingard was writing a story that conformed with the reality of what had actually happened. I mentioned earlier Adam Smith as the other important British Enlightenment figure, and we really can't forget him. It turns out that Hume wrote about, well, 4 books of note, maybe others as well. Apart from his history, he wrote 2 books on philosophy, covering pretty much the same ground, one more developed and written a little bit later than the other, and a book on moral thinking and economics. Adam Smith came along and he did almost the same thing. He wrote on philosophy and morals, and he also wrote on economics, so sort of 2 major works. And his work on economics, Adam Smith's work on economics, is known as The Wealth of Nations. That's the short title, but that's sufficient for you to go and find it. It's a delightful read, and there's a lot of useful stuff in The Wealth of Nations. It largely mirrors David Hume's book on political economy, which we don't tend to hear about a great deal. But Hume wrote on economics, but was remembered for his philosophy. Adam Smith, oddly enough, was a professor of philosophy, but it is his economics which is remembered. In fact, we refer to Adam Smith as the father of modern economics. So we've got a lot of parents as we go through. Machiavelli as the father of modernity, David Hume as the father of British empiricism, and Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, all coming out of the modern era. Let's look a little bit deeper now, though, at the moral aspect of the Enlightenment, especially coming from Hume. Hume's moral system is technically known as moral sentiment theory. Hume argued that the only things you can know are those things that come through the senses, and he also argued that morals, as they'd previously been understood and discussed and developed, had to do with relationships. And he would say, well, you don't actually see the relationships. I won't go into the details of it. You can look at Hume's work if you want to go further into it. But, for instance, he argued that if you have a tree grow up and a seed from that tree fall to the ground and a new tree grows out of it, and after a while this new tree, because it's maybe on more fertile soil or something, grows up to be bigger and stronger than the old tree, and the old tree ends up in its shadow, and because it's deprived of sunlight it dies. Hume would say, well, in fact what you've got there is matricide, the killing of one's parent, one's mother, because the new tree has actually murdered the old tree. And Hume says, well, obviously that's a bit ridiculous, a bit absurd to go and call one tree, a murderer because the parent tree died. And he said, well, it's the same thing with humans, really. And so this whole idea of murder is a bit ridiculous because, one person lives, another one dies. Maybe someone pointed a gun at him and so on, but, well, so what? I mean, what's the connection? We can't really see the relationships. Hume denied causality, and we've seen earlier that causality is the very basis of science. He turned science from something aiming at an understanding of cause to something aiming merely at an understanding or some sort of codification, a tabulation of relationships, of coincidences, of one thing happening near another. Hume would say, for instance, that if I go into a room, turn on the light switch, and the room lights up, I can't actually conclude that flicking a light switch turned on the lights. I can never do that. I can simply say there is a common coincidence happening there. And I live my life with these common coincidences. I never really know about electricity. It's a curious kind of approach and deserves a lot of time to go through, which we don't have time for here. But what that means is that you can't really do moral thinking, you can't do moral philosophy, because Hume would say that, well, why do people not like murder? Or why do they object to, mugging and perjury, rape, whatever? And Hume's conclusion was, well, we can't get upset about these things because they're intrinsically evil, or even because we can see some relationship going on, because morals are always to do with relationship. All we can say is there must be some feeling that you have, some emotion that wells up when you see something which we might call immoral happening. So if I see someone come along and beat up somebody mercilessly and maybe kill them, I feel revulsion at that, and I feel like I need to go and get a few of my mates to go up and beat up on the people who did that dreadful thing. And humans say, well, you know, the first people who were beating up were no better or worse than the second people who were beating up, just that the second people might call themselves the government and the judiciary and maybe the executioner sort of hanging the murderer. But really, isn't the executioner just doing the same thing as the murderer? And Hume would say that the only difference is that you feel bad when you see someone being murdered, you feel good when you see someone being executed, and so moral principles all come from feelings. Our immediate, visceral response, not rational response, but an emotional or passionate response. And so morality is simply what the moral actor feels or senses is right or wrong. Hume's primary argument, apart from his supposed metaphysical demolition of those relationships of causality, is that he said, well, everyone is horrified when they see violence, and so therefore we say that violence is bad. It's the universal feeling that is really the guide there, not the thing itself. And so you've got this idea that it's justified on the basis that everyone shares them. So it's popularity. The other thing about it, though, is that unlike previous moral systems, the moral sentiment theory has the advantage that it becomes very popular, because if you use moral sentiment theory, it means that if I feel like doing something, it must be right, because Hume said that the things that we feel give us moral values. And that's very comforting if I feel like going out and indulging a little bit of bank robbery or cannibalism or whatever. I'm going to feel comfortable, and I'll array myself with a bunch of friends that sort of feel the same way, and we can all go out and do our cannibalism or our bank robbery or whatever it is with impunity, because Hume has told us that everyone feels the same way. So if I feel comfortable doing something or other, then it is okay. That's the way he argued. We can look at some of the downsides. Some of you are probably wondering, how could such a bizarre idea become popular? Well, it had the advantage that the thought leaders in Enlightenment society in Europe were rather fond of the moral latitude that it opened up. Now, when we come to unpack moral sentiment theory, and you can think up some examples yourself, we talked about bank robbers. There are people that want to do bad things. There are people who want to cause harm and hurt to people. And so while the majority of the people might sort of feel bad when they see a bank robber or a cannibal or something at work, the fact is that the people that practice these things are, if you like, the very counter-argument. They are the demolition of moral sentiment theory. Moral sentiment theory only works in a world, some utopian world, where everyone is good. And so you don't need to think about what good means, because everyone's doing it already, and that's all they feel inclined to do. The whole moral question, the whole moral problem that's exercised the minds of humans right back to the first ones, was this problem of recognizing that people are inclined to do bad things. And so relying on this naive belief that everyone's going to be doing the right thing, feeling the right thing, choosing the right thing, is simply doesn't fit with the facts. The other thing about moral sentiment theory is that it eliminates moral discourse. How can you really discuss and develop a discussion of your feelings? I might like cannibalism. I feel good about it. You come along and say, I feel bad about cannibalism. I'm saying, well, that's okay for you. You feel bad about it, keep away from it. Don't join me for dinner next week. I feel good about it. You can't convince me of anything else because you're basically saying that's how you perceive the world. And I might agree with you. Yes, I can see you perceiving the world that way. And by the way, do you want to come over for dinner? I wouldn't mind having you for dinner, as a matter of fact. Because I'm comfortable doing that. In fact, I'm probably more comfortable with inviting you over for dinner than somebody else who is a cannibal, because I might have a bit of a fight on my hands getting dinner on the table if I invite someone who is a serious cannibal. Whereas if I know that you're a pacifist, then I think the expression is easy meat. But one way or another, we can't have moral discourse. You can't discuss a perception. You can simply note it. And you can't grade them. You can't say which one's better or worse. Another aspect of moral sentiment theory is that it means that you don't have to go outside of the individual, the moral actor, to go and find your moral principles. And so it means that morals are smaller than people. They're something that are within you and within me. And so they're smaller and they're as variable and as fickle as people themselves. It's a little bit inconvenient because it means that if the moral actor is the arbiter of moral acceptability, then there can be no way of socially deciding on what would be an appropriate standard of behaviour, moral principles or an ethic, whatever, for people. Because morals are smaller than people, they're not bigger. To have an ethic, say a professional ethic, you have to have something which is overarching, which actually covers the people, bigger than the people, bigger than the moral actor, to which the moral actor has to submit. Whereas in moral sentiment theory, you can't do that because it's the individual who decides what's reasonable. Ultimately, fairly obviously, moral sentiment theory is really moral philosophy emptied of content. There is no content. No intellectual content, no science to moral sentiment theory. It's about as scientific as my inclination to feel like an Italian meal tonight and a Chinese meal the next. It's simply a feeling. There's no right and wrong. There's no way of analysing, of scientifically measuring it and comparing it and so on. It's simply something which is there. It's just a feeling. And so there's no moral content. And with that, I think we might finish with the Enlightenment, or at least the Humean Enlightenment. We're now going to look at the second part of our waltz through modern moral systems. So far in the last presentation, or the first part of the presentation, we've looked at Machiavelli and David Hume, and we've said that David Hume fits in with a bunch of other people, Adam Smith, Rousseau, Voltaire, and so on. And we came down to moral sentiment theory. And that pretty much wraps up the Enlightenment. We'll move on to the next major system, but we'll do that in a separate presentation.